The assumption from the record from the insurrectionists targeting David wanted to censor and obstruct by human trafficking David so that he could not conduct his services to Congress as their projection. As intelligence oversight at the highest level for the military branch, David, as top general, would have to provide the resources to Congress in order to determine who is having contempt for government and the subversion of checks and balances, such as their contempt for court or contempt for Congress, which would generate the position of what they would primarily be seeking him. At which point, the highest grade function of the security engagements would be underneath David in those branches, at which point this high grade security market, uh, from their projections, state that those who captured double agents, in order to sentence them to the Confederacy for an act of treason, which is an aspect of the sedition in question by trying to block or obscure the functions of David's branch or other branches of the government doing services of the government. The blocking of the legal function of government is sedition. So those who engage in that are actively seeking the function of overthrowing the office, at which point the collections for being able to generate these offenses culminate in the full due diligence of the double agents, such as the threat of the Confederates, which would have been adapted under David as the aristocracy, getting the Convention of States to upgrade the Constitution to fit his security model, which would replace the $10,000 punishment with sentenced to life as a Confederate, as a separatist, at which point the separatist Confederates would be obligated to pay off their national debts, which will start with their personal liabilities and their attachments, at which point the profit motives of the excess advantages would be for the security functions to have captured these traitors, at which point the engagement of having proven it at all of the levels would have actively engaged in national security on the most essential functions of national security, which leads the insurrectionists to a position of a threat to the Confederacy, as its profits are illegitimate and its functions are criminal, such as their engagement of the investment into criminals, such as the Mexican cartels, which actively are promoted by them. The engagement of these investments actively encourage the function of military campaigns against their recruits, uh, which they would be incentivized as traitors to the United States to target David and get his branch into those wars. At which point, tricking Congress into co-signing sending David's branch to war would overlap the intelligence oversight function, at which point most of their missions would be kill him in war or destroy his units in war, at which point many of the escapades would have actively been engaged with that single motive in mind, with the eradication of his branch deliberately, at which point the destruction of David is their core identity, as they are traitors to the United States who need the government to not function in order to collapse into the parasite. At which point you have the function of the observation of the market which they think that they are obstructing, such as their targeted individual communities, such as the black community, which would have to have engaged in its investment into the risk management functions, which would have actively conducted them to the trade with David at the maturity of him stopping the crash of '08 and building his brokerage to the 800 billion marker for the layer, would sell the profits potential having already been proven of the 800 billion for their debts, at which point the debts having been traded at that level would have facilitated their cooperation with his construction of the Confederate business structure, allowing him to have a Confederate state by which to send the traders to. and the trading of that potential for the debts that are owed to them from being a targeted community illegitimately would have functioned in the proving of the due diligence of what they were obstructed from concerning their work, which builds into the engagements of what their actual properties would be and all of those advantages and amenities, which facilitates the real market in the capitalist society, which, having been targeted by the white nationalist terrorist organizations such as the KKK devil agents infiltrating the police and military, etc., such as the FBI's Nazi coup, from its founded on the basis of investing into Nazi Germany's birth for its Holocaust purposes, or the investment into the communists creating the Stalinism, Maoism, and other damages so that they can subvert those communities by getting the community's leaders to destroy their own interest in self-destructive mechanisms. So the messing with the enemy function of those engagements would have actively been the fault of the communists from the white nationalist wizards. So the wizard communists from that engagement creating those damages functionally makes them worse than all of the people that they tricked into doing it, because without them it doesn't exist. At which point you have the mechanism of proving all of these into the full due diligence from the investigation of the highly um, educated function, such as the engagement of the assumption that the market would have produced from the projection all of the men from the insurance market who would have had to have engaged in their protection of themselves and their community as the insurance market to engage in security functions. So all of them would have permits for weapons and actively have civilian grade positions and be trained at all levels of law enforcement, all of the way up to the function at the national level, and etc., which would give them all the duty under David's contracts to do protect and serve of everyone involved. So if there is a misadventure inside or outside of the market, then you have active investigators to be able to solve it readily through a series of calls to arms, which facilitates the general protection, the highest level, which would encourage the function of overlapping professions, which would facilitate the ease of collecting the functions of the desired amenities within inside the market. At which point you have the active advancement of credit, which engages in the ability for the most amount of potential people to purchase the most amount of potential things, increasing the credit's use at the highest level for the entire market for the highest grade amount of amenities, which facilitates the function of stabilized market, at which point the insurance management function would have actively engaged in the reasonable cap on this, um, which is still just the high grade encouragement for the high frequency trades on the market is capped at that level. So on the one level, you have those who are seeking wheat, and then on the other level, you have those who are seeking stone. So those who are seeking the pleasures would actively be participating, and they're assumed to be, from the 80-20 rule, to be doing 80% of the population doing the function of the high luxury amenities frequency in the market of the trading products and stuff, or purchasing products rather, with inside the market, and that 20% of them would actively be expanding, trying to build their nobility, at which point the market, being self-sustained to itself, would then upgrade into the function of nobility uh, from those investments as they have built their credit on that engagement in the stable market, accelerating to the higher and higher levels, which maintains the ability for the highest stability in the market, allowing them to ensure more effectively other markets, such as their treaties, such as the treaty with the United States and other countries, who would rely on these expanding nobles to be able to conduct functions from the state, David's state, from the treaty, to be able to protect their markets. So, with the historic position acknowledged, such as David's development of these security functions, you would have additional branches created specifically for the other essential functions, such as the variation of David's security for the judiciary to be enforced, at which point the order of the judiciary being ignored to desegregate the South and the school system wouldn't have been ignored, as that is an act of sedition. They are blocking the function of government by disrespecting the court's order, which is a legal obligation. At which point, the security function, having already existed at that point, means that that branch of the military would have already been enforcing specifically that order, which would have desegregated the South more effectively, as that is the objective of the risk management market, requiring the stabilizing of the destabilized function by the white nationalist terrorists, at which point you have a series of exponentially compounding positive arrangements which mature into the availability of the various parts of the community to conduct their original value, which Lindsey Graham's, from his estimate in the secret courts, assumed would make the United States too economically stable and viable for them to engage in their military coup against it, um, forcing them into a hot war, which they thought that David would win, as the super predators from the white nationalists are a super minority, and that super minority wizard cult, the devil worshipping Satanists responsible for the policies of the destruction and disrespect and conspiracy against the rights, are actively not actually significant. Their primary power is the illusion of intimidation, which is not viable if you have men inside the military. At which point, with the ability of having men in the military with a spine and self respect, the intimidation from the illusion becomes rather insignificant. If in the system you have various overlapping interests, such as the hyper trades function of the education, such as the observation that everyone would know how to do mechanic work for the hydrogen vehicles arranged, the engagement is the use of convenience. So they would be able to do it themselves, or they could have somebody else do it, at which point the function of them being able to do it is for the state of emergency, where the orchestrated mechanic wouldn't be there. At which point, if there is a state of emergency and you're separated from the rest of the community and you need to rejoin, you need to be able to rebuild everything. At which point, the function of you returning requires you to be able to actively engage in the profits of that sustained business, which would be able to conduct its normal functions at the status quo, at which point the function is not the act of it being a specialty that everyone else doesn't know, so much as it is an overlapping interchangeable function, which everyone has conceded to as um, the establishment of the market by their self sorting organizations. So you have these understandings that you have these obligational positions, um, especially the stage function of the strategic position to corner the essential functions, such as the acknowledgement that there are some locations that rely on nuclear power, at which point taking over the nuclear power plants and etc. would be the most effective way of preserving the network interest without being vulnerable to the arbitrary functions, at which point there would actively be the attachment of insurance, which would give them control over the function in the state of emergency, and the function of taking over the state of emergency, um, including making the upgrades from the policy in the insurance function, would actively put them in a position so that if there was an active disaster that happened, they would be able to take over the place and pay out the settlement, facilitating the reconstruction of the thing and cornering the market for the resurrection of the insurance market in the location. And these insurance functions actively overlap into the upgrade of the national security arrangements, where they would have specific policies for the insurance grade of the protection, um, of higher and higher weapons, which would be held by the individuals over the government established weaponry, as they personally customize their military grade weapons to their own interests, which would facilitate the acts of their drops and their shipping and their covers, at which point their ability to personally fund their aspect of the military for those functions and subunits would actively reinforce the position of the stable market into the most chaotic area. So if you're on a special mission or something, and you aren't able to dedicate that you're going to have enough ammunition in case of the staged graded emergencies, which can potentially go wrong, you would have unbreakable boxes and security locks holding the additional equipment which you would need in the potential emergency, which they would have mapped out under those arrangements, which would actively be a part of the function of the buildings, at which point going in fully equipped would be a function of the status quo training, um, not really caring about the function of the weights, because the engagement of the training is the acknowledgement of the obligation to have been in shape as an aspect of their security position in the insurance, not allowing it to be degraded like the Roman military downgrading their armor for their marches, which made them too weak. That would actively be ignored for these types of functions, at which point they would all be able to do all of it all of the time under these strategic advantages, maintaining the function of the lowest amount of human resources being able to accomplish the highest amount of security functions, um, which would actively be allowed to be compounded into the Call of Arms function by other members of the network, which could have been involved in it. So if they need to be recruited really quickly or deputized really quickly, then the resources would be actively available for those arrangements, facilitating the highest grade stability, at which point the function of the most stable wealth is the construction as the primary interest of the network. Now, if you move on to the function of the dividends function of the market inside the network for the insurance market or risk management market, you have the automatic attachment to the stabilizing of paying of all of the bills, as the covering function of those investments is the security, at which point those who have the responsibility of guardianship or other functions of alliances and coalition functions, you would have the active engagement of having built their nobility for the stability of the society, which would actively use those dividends stocks in order to cover the liabilities, at which point the function is not that they are paying the bills of the benefactors so much as they are paying into an insurance bond which covers the function, at which point it wouldn't trigger, at which point the use of this function is the increase of their social credit or their bonus credit score. And the use of increasing the bonus credit score would only increase in proportion to the functionality of how useful it is in practice for the market. So if nothing happens because the person was reliable, then you would have the lower grade. And then if the person needed the assistance and it was proven to not be their fault, then you would have a higher grade. And the more irresponsible they are, than the lower the grade because low projection abilities. If you invest highly poorly, then you are losing the more. So, by definition, it wouldn't be a function of building nobility. So, in this engagement, you would actively have for participating members the full coverage of those functions, regardless of their various weaknesses, at which point those weaknesses can cover for the functionality of their increased frequency inside the market, as they're able to keep the grades of the objectives of the insurance recommendations, allowing for the acceleration and stability of the larger business functions in the network interest. So at that point, you have the most well-oiled function of the general market, even in the passive aspects, which actively accelerates the importance, which is actively trackable to the general community, which would, by definition, preferring this over being destabilized into a targeted community under a divide and conquer military campaign, would actively have to demonstrate their endorsement for those members who are central to their security, which expands into their preference on investments in collaborations, of their willingness to engage in investments of their services without the use of payment, um, on the advantage of who is more valuable to the community at that level, which facilitates the expansion collaborations into the function of the general market outside of the network market, such as the treaty holding nation. So if you're actively expanding and your function is to develop this system and you're trying to engage in the use of Hollywood, for instance, then your active assertion of your most reliable team and who you're willing to risk the most for under the full protection of those arrangements would facilitate your active expansion in that particular area, facilitating your portion of the propaganda machine. The use of the dividends inside the market facilitates the majority of the investment functions, which overlaps into the automating nobility building structure of the bonus credit system, which actively takes what could be anything like 1 or 2% against a 5 to 10% bill, in order to stabilize the insurance function. Means by definition, if it's 2% to a 10%, then you have 5 times the amount that you have to invest into the stocks in order to acquire the 10% of the same amount of the larger bill. Um, at that point, you have the functionality of how the insurance market is actively validated by the stabilizing of the general investments inside of the market, which normalizes the profit motive for each of the various risk management functions. There is an exponential catastrophic threat from the wizard communists, which actively compels the market to react to them according to these functions and many others which are obstructed or too complicated and in depth for me to be able to cover in a single breath, such as the function of the projection of Anthony Fauci creating AIDS as a conspiracy theory, which is functionally believable, as that would be a normal thing that they would have conducted in the gain of function research from the military industrial educational complex, which is actively incorporating the education system for fake science in order to expand the various threats, which would explain the reason it would have been used to engage in the destruction or the contracted abuses against the homosexual and other targeted communities, until they were actively pushed into the position where they would be um, started to get the attention to be cured. At which point the use is the hyper investment into destruction until you have the counteraction, The artificial overreaction creates the artificial reaction, which materializes the stability of the legitimacy of that particular community. And the assumption that AIDS was created by the government is actively reinforced by the fact that the medical community had to suffer the position of actively being told to not prepare themselves, similar to other historic positions, such as the use of the discovery of washing your hands before surgeries and other medical procedures, which was actively condemned, which is an assumed function of the wizard communists. At which point, the use of the medical community becoming artificially vulnerable to those functions stated that they weren't able to take precautions, that they were actively, it's not just that they weren't able to refuse to work on them, they were actively told to become exponentially more vulnerable so that the members of the medical community would get sick with the AIDS in question. And this also includes the function of California selling contaminated blood to Canadians, which got them killed. This functions as the status quo engagement of espionage war terrorist functions for the exchanges on the black market, which actively fund their non-power of the purse engagements, separating themselves from the subordination of Congress. At which point you have these catastrophic threats from the infinite diversity point of view, which would require the use of specific in-depth research and protection mechanisms in order to have a secure enough market to not be vulnerable to these artificial poisonings, which are exponentially invested into in the wizard communist market, which is the objective recognition that the white nationalist confederacy are the enemy and have always been the enemy of the American people, which they, having viewed with contempt, have actively survived off of the systems of increased injury or punishments and retaliations, as abuse is their core identity. It is important to understand that the wizard communists, as an active military threat engaged in espionage war, are conducting KKK functions for the purpose of destroying the general society, which has historically negatively impacted the entirety of the nation and its allies, at which point the manufacture of the terrorist threats around the world generates the position of the primary function of the intelligence oversight, engaging in the counter to the insurgent function, at which point the insurgent terrorists in the KKK arrangement materializes the obligation to counter their criminal conspiracies by the use of the excess function by those seeking the nobility for the investment into the engagement of solving the threat, at which point the status quo payment of the structure would materialize the work opportunities for those nobility, which is the function of investing into the credit over the use of payment, at which point you have the system of stabilizing the total society as a security function, receiving the insurance security or payments, at which point your active position would materialize into the superior nobility and opportunities, which manufactures the acceleration through the market, despite the hesitancy of other ways of maintaining themselves, as stability is the primary resource. The profits are presumed from this arrangement to actively be divided to the investment into the stabilizer, at which point the function of having conducted the profits of successfully subverting the wizard communists would generate the obligation of maintaining those profits, which engaging in the function of nobility, which is the concept of personal profits, which would be considered a wheat function or consumption function, versus a nobility function, which is more of a stone function, or the engagement of the security function in general, maintains the protection of the general community as an accelerant from a bonus credit system, which generates your ability to sustain higher reputation which gives the additional benefits and the amenities which would automatically be delivered by those who needed it under the trackable aspects. They would understand who they would need to have celebrated as a matter of providing these additional bonuses or coupons, maintaining the arrangements of the accelerated by positive reputation. And the various aspects of doing this would engage in the function of the personalizing of those various amenities, which would be specific to the function of how the solution happened, which would craft the automated function from the underlings into the function of promoting the noble, facilitating the ease of their engagement as a noble off of dividends and excesses, which would have maintained their ability to exponentially compound their nobility as they not having to take care of those functions can spare the additional resources to stabilize the system, generating the primary interest of the recovery for the insurance of those who conduct the insurance function, automating the activity of the restoration of these engagements of the security protection of the obstructed markets, allowing for the resurrection and reconstruction of those arrangements, which would have generated the presumption of it being an investment into the nobility over consumables, which would facilitate their hyperacceleration into nobility as a security function against the war efforts by the criminal arrangements, such as the satanic rituals, which have been the primary resource of the adversaries in question, maintaining the threat against the various peoples and the security function of the various peoples, which any force will stay in motion unless acted upon by equal or greater force, which qualifies the obligation to collect an equal or greater force against the criminals in order to arrange for the security of all.